Hello and welcome back to the channel. In this video we're going to talk about jazz. Now, as classical musicians, jazz may be a bit like the forbidden fruit. It's something that those musicians over there do and we sometimes dream about. But for us classical guitarists, jazz and blues actually have remained integral to our repertoire, despite the fact that it's not as integral a part for other classical musicians and their instruments. So we have a lot of examples of jazz within our own repertoire. Just a few examples. The Serbian composer Dusan Bogdanovic has written a wonderful jazz sonata, which is jazz in style, has improvisatory space and elements, and draws on jazz harmony. But there are many other examples. Andrew York has a piece called Freelin, which is wonderful, jazz-inspired, kind of blending of jazz and classical harmonies in places. And I just finished a piece, a lesson on a piece by the French guitarist and composer Thierry Tisserand, who's a wonderful classical and jazz guitarist and composer, from his prelude from Jazibao. It's a great jazz ballad, and it's what you're hearing in the background right now. The second part of that two-part piece, Jazibao, is called Samba, which draws on Brazilian influences within jazz. So there are many examples of jazz within the classical guitar repertoire. Another one is Matthew Dunn's Jazz Etudes, which is specifically geared toward introducing traditional jazz elements to the classical guitarist. Something I would highly recommend, even though it is quite advanced music. And so in this video, we're going to talk about a very brief introduction to jazz harmony. This is not meant to be comprehensive. I am not a jazz guitarist. I'm not an expert in this field whatsoever. And so there may be places where I can be corrected, and I would encourage those of you who are jazz guitarists to step in and say, this can better be understood like this. But from my own experience playing in jazz bands and being self-taught in jazz, the purpose of this video is to guide you as classical musicians to make the transition from classical harmony to jazz harmony. So there are lots of things we're not doing in this video. We're not talking about rhythms in jazz, which are very different from classical rhythms. There's usually a lot more syncopation within jazz rhythms. We're not talking about chromaticism, that is taking a typical jazz progression, how those lines are connected through chromaticism. We're not talking about modes. So there are a lot of things we're not touching on. This is just a brief introduction to jazz harmony for classical guitarists. So let's jump right into it. So I think there's this common assumption that in jazz, anything goes. Because it's a more improvisatory character in the music, that you can sort of play whatever you want. But in truth, jazz harmony is very much like classical harmony. It's functional in nature. That is, the relationship between the chords and how they connect to one another serves a purpose. There's always an intention toward those chords. They have a function to get us from one place to another place, and usually back to the place where we began. So going from home, departing from home to a place that leads us back home. That journey of there and back again, to quote Bilbo Baggins, is all over classical music, but it's also all over jazz. So a very common, in fact, the most common chord progression that we encounter in classical period music is going from home. That's our tonic, a very stable chord. It feels nice and calm. We're home. Very comfortable. And then we go to a chord that's full of tension. Sorry. And wants to resolve back to home. We also have sometimes another chord that comes between those two chords, which is kind of like traveling music. So we start home. We depart. Feels pretty stable still. It doesn't have a lot of tension to it. It could go back home. could go somewhere else, and that's often what it does, and then we go back home. So those chords that I just played, C major, F major, G7, those are typically referred to as tonic, subdominant, and dominant. And those refer to the scale degrees, but they also refer to the functions of those chords. The subdominant, for instance, is under the dominant, so it leads to the dominant usually. The dominant is a chord full of tension and power that leads us back home to tonic, which is our root chord where we go back home. That relationship is so important in classical period music. And so we encounter it all over the place. Home, traveling music, tension, and back home. Now you could think about those relationships in different ways, of course. That movement of home and away and back is just one sort of analogy for thinking through those relationships. You could, of course, come up with your own analogy that works a little bit better for you, but there's a very distinct function of each of those chords that has a tendency that's very common within classical music. So when we hear this, we expect to go back home to that C chord. And there's a good reason for that, actually. There's a particular interval in a dominant chord that we usually refer to as the tritone, and that relationship there, those two notes want to resolve in opposite directions back home. So that's why that dominant chord tends to go back home, is because the tritone interval is so full of tension that points in opposite directions to the resolution within our tonic, our home chord. Jazz is basically doing exactly the same thing. In fact, we have the same relationships of tonic, subdominant, and dominant in jazz. We just changed some details along the way. So for instance, in jazz, the most common progression is not 1, 4, and 5, but instead 2, 5, and 1. Now, how do we get a 2 in there? Well, at least as far as I understand it, early on when blues and jazz were developing, bass players had difficulty with the subdominant, and so they would substitute the relative minor. So you may remember from your theory lessons that a relative minor is made up of all of the same notes of a major chord, but it begins and ends on a different note. So for instance, in the key of C major, that's our C major scale, its relative minor is A minor. So exactly the same key signature, no sharps, no flats, but it begins and ends on A instead of C. Exactly the same notes. The same thing applies to our subdominant chord, F major. Its relative minor is D minor. Same notes, so in F major, we begin and end on F, F, G, A, B flat, C, D, E, F, and in D minor, exactly the same applies. D, E, F, G, A, B flat, C, D. So we still have that one flat in there. We just begin and end on a different note. So jazz players, bassists in particular, started substituting that 2 chord for the subdominant. So we'd have a D minor instead of F major, in the key of C at least. But it's important to keep in mind that jazz players didn't invent the 2-5-1 progression. It's all over classical music, actually. And there's a good reason why. There's a very clear relationship between 2, 5, and 1. They move in a cycle of fifths, going from the 2 to the 5 and from the 5 to the 1. So I'll give you one example, just one example in classical period music for the classical guitar, where we have a 2-5-1 progression. This is from Sohr Study Number 9, Opus 60, which he wrote at the very end of his life, and it was intended for beginners. You probably are familiar with this piece. But at the very end of the piece, in measure 15, we have this. So D minor, that's the 2 chord. G major, that's the 5 chord. C major. That's the 1 chord. So we have a 2, 5, 1 here. And actually, if we go back a measure, we have a 6 chord, 2, 5. And the reason that's important is 6, 2, 5, 1 is also a very common progression in jazz. And it has that same movement of 6 to 2 is a fifth, 2 to 5 is a fifth, and 5 to 1 is a fifth. So that movement, the cycle of fifths that we're encountering here goes from 6 to 2 to 5 to 1. Soar, of course, knew this and used it quite heavily in his music, the cycle of fifths. But it's also very common in jazz. So jazz harmony is functional just like classical harmony, and not only is it functional just like classical harmony, but it's the same functions as we have in classical period music. But there is another thing about jazz that's quite different from classical harmony. We do have those strong relationships of the parallel moving fifths and that cycle of fifths where we have some very clear relationships between the notes and those chords. But jazz players also started to add another interval on the top of each of these chords, and that's the 7th. And so for C major, instead of C major, they would add a 7th to that and make it C major 7. And to the 2 chord, the D minor, they would take that D minor chord and add a minor 7. So it became a D minor 7. And to the 5 chord, they would make that into a dominant 7 chord. So very common sort of sound that you might hear in jazz standards. Right? So, you know, that's a sound that you're probably very familiar with in jazz standards. The reason, though, that the 7th chord was so important is that we can extend the 7th chord. We can add even more intervals on top of that 7th chord to give it additional color. And so to the C7 chord, we could add a 9th, for instance. That really changes the flavor of that chord, doesn't it? It's still a tonic chord. It's still very stable compared to the dominant chord, so it serves the same function, but now it has more color than you would get in, say, Fernando Sor or Johann Sebastian Bach. The D minor 7 chord, we could add a 9th to that as well and make a minor 9 chord. Really quite beautiful, right? Or to the 7 chord, the dominant 7, we could add a 13 on the top. We could even flat the 13 for extra tension. You might be familiar with that kind of sound of resolving to the C major 7. So the functions are still the same. We have that tension that wants to resolve back home, but there's additional color with those 7th chords and their extensions. Now I say extensions because when we have a 9th or an 11th or a 13, we're just adding above the octave. So if you if you subtract 7 from each of those numbers, 9 minus 7 is 2. So all that we're doing with a C major 9 chord is adding the 2 on the top, D. For the D minor 9, it's the same thing. We're going to add the 9, so 2 up here on the top. We have that E, sorry, it's right up here on the top for the D minor 9. So D, F, C, and then the C is the flat 7, by the way, and then there's the E, which is the 9. A 13 is 6. So again, subtracting 7 from that number, we get the 6th. And for G7, E is the 6th of G. So that's the 13. And again, we can make that a sharp 13. We can make it a flat 13 for different kinds of color. So that's the main difference between jazz and classical harmony, is that we have those 7th chords and extensions that add additional color to the functions. Something else that's really common, though, is we have a lot more changing of keys in jazz. And the way that we get from one key to another is through the use of something called a secondary dominant. Now this is also very common in classical period music. So if we go back to our source study number 9, at the end of the very first section of that piece, we have this C, and then D7, which doesn't fit the harmony of C major at all, but it is the dominant chord of G major, which is the dominant chord of C. And so we call that the 5 of 5, the dominant of the dominant, or a secondary dominant. It has that same function of tension that wants to resolve, and in this case it wants to resolve up to G major. So we're going to treat G major as a temporary home then, and you'll notice in the next section we're still in G major. At least for a time, until we finally end back on C major. So in jazz there are a lot more of those secondary dominants that pop up, and they usually will take us in a little bit of a detour. They will usually take us far away from home at times before we have to make a little bit of a detour back to get back to home. So those are the main differences between jazz and classical harmony. We still have the same functions of tonic, subdominant, and dominant, but we have some substitutions like the 2 chord for the 4. Sometimes we'll have the relative minor of the 1 chord that we talked about, A minor. The 6th chord, that's the relative minor of C major. Sometimes that will substitute for the 1 chord. And then we also have those 7th chords and their extensions. All of those really change up the feel of jazz from classical, along with those secondary dominants that can sometimes take us far afield from home. So there you have it. That's just a quick, brief introduction to jazz harmony for classical guitarists. It's really meant to help you transition from classical harmony to jazz harmony. And once you do, you're going to start to see some overlaps from our traditional classical music and jazz. For instance, if you play the music of Debussy or Ravel, Impressionist music, or Ponce, who is extremely influenced by the French Impressionists, you'll notice those extensions of 7th chords are all over that music, and so you'll start to see those jazz harmonies in Ponce, even though he wasn't strictly a jazz practitioner. So I hope this gives you some knowledge and freedom to begin to experiment with some of the jazz that's already integrated into our classical guitar repertoire, and I hope you enjoy that process. Thanks, take care.